Those were the days.
Hey everyone, Justin Lee Harold here with another edition of Those Were the Days Extended. And today we're going to take a trip exploring the early days of one of my favorite couples, and I'm sure one of yours too, Wilson, aka Will and Sonny. And to start it off, I'm going to take you guys back to April 3rd, 2014, when Will and Sonny married each other. Here we have the wedding photo picture. If you remember, we had Grandma Marlena officiating, and then we had the two moms here walking their sons down the aisle here. This was such a big wedding at the time, I think, because again, first gay couple on the show, or maybe not first gay couple, but first really legitimized gay couple on the show, having a wedding and have it sort of go through without, without it being a typical sort of Salem wedding here. I must say, I remember this. I loved this wedding. I loved the detail of it. I loved how it was taken seriously. It was, again, not a traditional Salem wedding with the studs and shows, but it was one that was sort of really heartfelt and one that I think both of these characters deserved. And just, yeah, I mean, everything from the wedding vows to great grandmother Caroline Brady sort of getting up and telling that story. And if you remember, it was also happening simultaneously with the Alzheimer's stories that she was going through. So having her get up, I think there was that little trepidation of, oh my God, what is she going to say? Is she going to say something embarrassing? And then she just delivered this sort of heartfelt sort of monologue about this couple, gay couple that used to come into the pub and how they were hiding their life and their love, and how far we've come with it, now seeing sort of Will and Sonny stand there and be married in public in Salem with their moms and their family and friends. And yeah, this was one of those ones I think will go down as one of Salem's best weddings. And just, yeah, everything from everyone looked beautiful. I think Alison Sweeney, this is the best I think she's ever looked. She just looked amazing, I think, in that wedding. One of the things that always sort of stood out to me. But yeah, we'll sort of go take a little trip down memory lane as we sort of explore how Will and Sonny came to be. If you remember, they actually had their first meeting at it was actually at Will's high school graduation, and who of course introduced them, but their common cousin, Abigail. Again, she's Will's cousin on his dad's side, and Sonny's cousin through the Devereaux clan, of course, Will's cousin through the being a Horton. So yeah, Abigail actually introduced them, and they seem to have sort of a little bit of a common knowledge of each other through Abigail. I guess she apparently has talked about them to each other and always wanted them to meet. So this is when it happened. This was June of 2011. Will was already starting to kind of question his sexuality at this point, and Sonny coming onto the scene was very much an out and proud gay man, young, sort of living his life. He was adventurous. He was sort of had smart. We know he was business minded, and sort of was sort of mentored by Victor a little bit, and had this sort of special relationship with him. So that was sort of Sonny coming onto the scene, and I think it coinciding with Will questioning his sexuality at this time. But Will, again, was just graduating high school. He was still with high school sweetheart Gabby, if you remember. And as she was sort of beginning to get frustrated with his lack of interest in being intimate with her, of course, that was the beginning of the writing on the wall of Will sort of coming to terms with being gay, and, a later infamous coming out story to follow. But yeah, Will and Sonny sort of started their friendship and even became business partners with chat along the way. um, Will began his journey. We saw that sort of coming out story, which I think will probably go down as one of Day's best. We saw it play out um, with Marlena as sort of a co-star to that storyline. I think the writers really took their time with it. They really gave it the care and attention. It wasn't played for laughs. It wasn't played for, frivolity. It was really taken serious. And I think, like I said, I think it's going to go down as one of the great sort of insular kind of capsule storylines that Days ever done, the handling and the care that they took with Will coming out in his sexuality and kind of using Sonny as a little bit of a catalyst here, but it wasn't the main focus. It wasn't Will, sort of hormones raging, just wanting Sonny all the time, and that's what spurred this. It was really Sonny coming on, him kind of having some feelings and dealing with some things, and again, we saw how that come out, how that sort of turned out. Of course, with Marlena, sort of acting as Will's psychiatrist, his is not conscience, but sort of a person to for him to to go back and forth with, as he was sort of coming to terms with everything. And so, yeah, that was sort of how that was the main storyline that sort of took over, but Sonny was sort of in the background of that, sort of again as a catalyst to Will coming out. Again, as Will sort of dealt with his journey, sexuality, Sonny was sort of waiting idly by. I think there was this really concentrated effort for Sonny not to sort of insert himself in that. I think he really sort of wanted Will to come to his own terms about it, and to sort of play a supportive friend and confidant, and just show Will that it was, things get better on the other side, and to be an example of that. I like that the writers didn't insert Sonny too much into that storyline, and they didn't make him, he was a little bit of a catalyst there, but he wasn't the main reason for it. He wasn't the protagonist in that storyline, and he was sort of letting Will sort of do his own thing and come to it. And I really like that they took their time with this. And as I said, it wasn't Sonny pressuring him. It wasn't Sonny constantly hitting on him or wanting him to come out so they can have a relationship. It was really him sort of wanting Will to come to the table, as a fully formed person, knowing who he was and what he wanted, and they could sort of kind of go from there. So yeah, I like that they took that aspect of it. I think different times, or with a straight couple, it would have been 0 to 60. And so I like that they let that storyline really breathe with Will and Sonny. But there were a lot of they had a lot of things to navigate in the beginning. It wasn't just Will's sexuality and Sonny being a new character coming to town. They really incorporated the family into this early on. They had this smaller storyline where Adrian didn't think Will was good enough for Sonny, which at first on its head was sort of really strange and weird. Like, Will at this point we saw was such a good kid and we watched him grow up. So it was a little daunting when that first happened. But I think what the writers were doing, if you were watching back then, they were sort of doing a play on the Adrian and Justin storyline, where she herself was not considered good enough for Justin back then. She was poor. She was from the wrong side of the tracks. So Victor sort of very leaned into Justin not being with Adrian at the time, because she wasn't good for him in Victor's eyes. So I think they were trying to recreate that a little bit and do a little bit of nod history with the Adrian character there. But eventually, of course, she came around. Then we had sort of Lucas sort of worrying about Sonny here in this case, more in terms of hurting Will because he was newly out. An idea that Sonny was sort of a lot more experienced. He was a little bit more worldly. He's a few years older than Will. He'd already been to college and traveled the world a little bit. And so there was a little bit of trepidation from Lucas there about not wanting his son to sort of jump into this full relationship where he was just coming to terms with being gay and being out and dealing with that. So yeah, they started off with kind of a little bit of family stuff, not the typical homophobia we would get in a storyline with this, but just two sort of concerned parents coming from two different angles here. That, of course, those things were resolved in Adrian, of course, came to accept Will, and Lucas, of course, came to sort of back off and see that they were good for each other there. We also were dealing with Will's own insecurities about his lack of experience, about being newly out, and of course, Sonny, kind of not being around the block, so to speak, but kind of having more experience than him. And, it sort of put their relationship on an uneven playing field. So they were kind of dealing with that. But all in all, I think their initial connection and bringing them together was dealt just really well, and really with a lot of grace and sensitivity to the storyline. I think as I said before, the writers really took their time, not only in the Will coming out storyline, but also bringing Sonny to the forefront of this and really sort of pushing them to sort of have a solid relationship in the front without too much craziness going on, outside of, the parental stuff. But I'd say their biggest curveball or their biggest stake is sort of having Gabby and Will have a baby. And we see sort of the inclusion of Ari here. We know, of course, that storyline where Will was sort of falling for Sonny and got really spooked and got really scared and just sort of fell back into this one night stand with Gabby. Again, of course, they were high school sweethearts back then, so they were going through their own stuff. They decided to have a sort of not last stand, but one night stand, last ditch effort to sort of convince Will of the fact that he was gay and that's what he really wanted. And yeah, sort of result of that was the pregnancy. Talking about this, I want to actually remove the Nick Fallon portion of this. I know he was a big part of that initial storyline there, but I kind of want to just focus more on the blended family aspect of this. I think originally, I know for me, when Gabby got pregnant, I kind of rolled my eyes and was like, oh God, are we going there with this? Like, Will just came out, he's just with Sonny now. He sort of has a lapse in judgment or gets a little scared or nervous. He sleeps with Gabby and now they're pregnant and we're getting a baby storyline for these two characters, which just kind of seemed a little out of the blue. I think I looked at it more as them going backwards with this storyline and not forward. But I have to say, I think this was one of the best ideas they could have did for this couple. I think it kind of allowed them to cement them as a couple with the fabric of the show. I think it was a great opportunity to show the addition of a blended family and a blended family really quickly, with having Will and Sonny being newly together, having to deal with Gabby's pregnancy. We had a little bit of the Nick stuff early on that cemented them coming together and really fighting for each other and fighting for their coupledom, so to speak. But sort of when the dust settled, I think the way they took this on as this unconventional new blended family of Salem with two gay dads and a mom here. And over the years, they've handled this with such care with the co-parenting aspect of it. I think at different times of the show, depending on who was on the show at the time, they played with it where, Gabby's been the majority parental parent. Maybe if Sonny and Will were off, or there was a point where, of course, we know Will was killed and then he was off and her and Sonny were sort of co-parenting together. Or then when we know Gabby went to prison for a period of time, and then Will and Sonny were sort of the dominant parents as two gay dads, sort of raising Ari as their own. So just hats off to them on how they sort of handled this. As I said, I think in a different, I think if this were a straight couple, it would have felt like too much too soon. But I think with doing this with a gay couple and also having the inclusion of Gabby and having them come together, it was more of a blended family storyline. So I think it might have been one of the best things they did. And of course, they carry that to this day with, I guess, in this iteration, we have Will and Sonny sort of off canvas raising Ari. And then, Gabby mentions her every once in a while, whether she's visiting or Gabby's visiting her. So they've really stuck with this idea of this blended family with the two gay dads and mom. And I think, yeah, like I said, I think it's one of the best things that Days has ever done. And I think it, again, helps cement the Will sort of Sonny couple as sort of legitimate by giving them an instant family. So yeah, the next part or the next hurdle I'd say that Will and Sonny came against was definitely the addition of Mr. Paul Narita here. Sort of, and I like what they did here too with a lot of the stakes and a lot of the trials and tribulations that Will and Sonny had early on was either, Will's sexuality, the coming out storyline, it was some of the family stuff, then it was Nick, and then it was the baby, and then it was them coming together as a blended family. So I think they earned this when they finally brought in Christopher Sean as Paul Narita a few years later. And I think they brought him in at the sort of perfect time. If you remember what was going on in the storyline was that Will had just come back from his sort of sabbatical. He had left town with Sammy and the kids. This was when Alison Sweeney was leaving town, and the premise was that they were sort of making a movie of Sammy's life. Will was tasked with writing it, and so they were leaving for a few months, and then this was sort of Will coming back. And if you remember, when he came back, it was actually played by Guy Wilson at the time. And when he came back, he was sort of had just been fired and had this unsuccessful sort of time in LA as a screenwriter. Him and Sonny weren't really connecting like they used to, and so we were seeing the sort of beginning of trials and tribulations of this married couple and them having like some real actually marital woes now. And then in comes, of course, Paul Narita, who is the ex-boyfriend of Sonny, ex-athlete boyfriend of Sonny, who is still closeted and has come to Salem for this surgery while he's sort of going to announce his retirement. And then we had Will being tasked to sort of write this article about him. And then what happened here was surprising because it wasn't, I think, what the stereotypical thing to do would have been to have Sonny sort of pick up with Paul again. And they didn't do that. What they had was Will and Paul sort of had this attraction in this one night stand that sort of spiraled into causing, this sort of real big first sort of marital issue of infidelity between Will and Sonny. And I gotta say, I'm using this picture here of Chandler Massey because I was trying to find a picture of all three of them sort of looking at the camera, and it was really hard. But I do want to say, I want to really take a few minutes to shout out Guy Wilson in this storyline. I know he may not have been everyone's favorite Will, and Chandler's so beloved and amazing, and what he did with the coming out storylines. So I think he sort of became cemented as the defining Will. But I do want to give a really, really big amount of credit here to Guy Wilson, who was playing Will at this time, and I think actually really helped and contribute to, I want to say, like the sexuality portion of this when they brought in Christopher Sean, and they were really selling the fact that Sonny and Will were having issues, and that Will and Paul were sort of coming together, and it was sort of this, animal attraction, these two men sort of really being attracted to each other and sort of going at it. I will say, Guy, I think with and Christopher Sean too, just really had that amazing chemistry, and they really sold the sexuality of them two being attracted to each other. And you see why they would have the one night stand and, the infidelity of this sort of wonderful pairing of Wilson that we all love. But I think it was time to shake things up a bit. And I think Guy Wilson was really great in helping usher that in, honestly. So again, I got to give a lot of credit to Guy here. And I think he played that portion of Will too. Was also, I think they were trying to emulate Will as being a little bit like Sammy at that point. So he was a little bit more devious, a little bit more, Sammy and Lucas like. And I think having Guy come in and handle that portion of the storyline, I think really worked well. I think he had amazing chemistry with Christopher Sean. And I think their attraction scenes, that one night stand, their sex scenes were just really, really, I think, hot. And I think they displayed that all around. So again, I want to take a minute to sort of give Guy Wilson. I know he hasn't played Will in many years, but I want to give him a shout out here. He just did such great work with Christopher Sean in selling that version of Will for that time. But yeah, that was sort of a little trip down memory lane for Will and Sonny. Again, their storyline continued. We had another round of Paul, Will, and Sonny in different iterations. We had the death of Will. We had the resurrection of Will. We had Leo Stark thrown in there for good measure, which I'm sure I will probably examine that at a later portion. But yeah, this was sort of a little trip down memory lane for the beginning portion of Wilson, a couple that I still think is so viable and so great, and there's so much more story to tell with them that I think we're due for them to come back, hopefully soon, whether that's Chandler Massey, whether that's Freddie Smith, whether it's Christopher Sean. We know is in and out as Sonny. But yeah, just hats off to them, especially those early days. I think were such pitch perfect for establishing this couple. And like I said before, hats off to the writers for the way they handle those early years, and especially Will's coming out to sort of get him to that point where he could be in a viable sort of couple-domer relationship with Sonny. So yeah, that was this week's Those Were Days Extended, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.
Those were the days.